Okay, first I want to welcome everybody to our next lecture series for the spring. My name is Jeffrey Nesbitt, and currently the H. Dean Pierce Endowed Chair here in the College of Architecture. I would first like to acknowledge that the lecture series is organized by a team of quite dedicated and hardworking faculty and staff, including Zara Safaverdi, Noemi Desplan-Lichter, Lindsay Meems, Rachel Rowe, Oscar Natividad, Jeff Hoover, Denny Mingus, and Grace Shanks, our kind student representative. I would also like to thank our interim dean, Upe Flukiger, as well as Dr. Clifton Ellis, who will be the respondent in today's lecture. Our guest this afternoon is Charles Davis, is an associate professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Buffalo, and currently serving as a visiting faculty member in the School of Architecture at Princeton University. His important research and scholarship excavate the role of racial identity and race thinking in architecture and contemporary design culture. Particularly, his work has opened up critical conversations surrounding the overlooked contributions of Black artists and architects in shaping the built environment. Among numerous accolades and awards, he is the co-author of Race in Modern Architecture, a critical history from the Enlightenment to the present, Building Character, the racial politics of modern architectural style, and currently work on his forthcoming book, tentatively titled Black by Design, an interdisciplinary history of making in modern America. Quite an impressive collection of work. Perhaps on a slightly more personal note, I had the pleasure of teaching with Charles in Charlotte over 5 years ago during a difficult time when the North Carolina governor signed the first Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act, commonly known as the HB2 bill in the country, and immediately following by the police shootings of Keith Lamont Scott, stirring up city protests in the downtown streets of Charlotte, just a few blocks from both of our neighborhoods. I describe these moments in our history to hopefully broaden our own awareness of the challenges we still face as so-called designers of the built environment. And Charles's research and teaching enables this collective discussion and brings race, style theory, and design to the forefront in our contemporary design discourse. His presence in the school was infectious, and his studios were groundbreaking efforts to discuss race, history, and architecture. Charles might be known for his architectural histories and scholarship, but for me personally, his kindness, intelligence, and keen insights are incredibly inspiring, and I hope you agree. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Charles Davis.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that introduction. I wanted to talk to you guys today just a little bit, probably about 40 minutes or so, about a place that architects at least tend to spend a considerable amount of time in, which is the architecture studio. And I wanted to mine some of the historical roots of the architecture studio as a way of thinking about the racial discourses that actually frame our practice in ways that we may not really understand, but intellectually, but we may understand in terms of everyday practices. And so revisiting an institution like the Ecole des Beaux-Arts in France and looking at the ways that it has influenced thinking in the United States is my way of mining some of the racial discourses that come along with what architectural practice is. And hopefully this will be able to generate some discussion about how it is that it has influenced the foundation of architecture professionalism in the US today, but also what we might want to do about it in the present and the future as we move forward. So I'm just going to share a PowerPoint and get started here. So my first question for the audience to consider is, what was the Ecole des Beaux-Arts? What do we mean when we say this term? Are we really talking about a place? Are we talking about a set of ideas and practices? And if so, what is its relevance to us today? Well, let's start with the place. If you were to go to Paris, France, and you were to locate the actual physical site of the school, you'll find the remnants of a building or a set of buildings that the architect Félix Dubin put together as a way of commemorating and physically memorializing the school after the French Revolution and the changes that took place in its pedagogy. You'd come through a series of gates and you'd come onto a public square like this one, where much of the education of the school was in the disposition of its parts as an architectural assemblage. And so we have here, and if you go over time, you'll see that the elements, the fragments have changed. But the purpose of this courtyard and the building itself is to collect all of the significant elements of architectural history and to display it back to the public, but particularly to students so that they would understand what this was about. This was true of the interior of the building itself. And here's a contemporary photograph of the Palais des Études, where the students would come to get lectures and instructions in history. But this was also the famous hall where historical busts and reproductions of architectural elements would be placed in display for the students. And they could come here and sketch and also sculpt together. And because the School of Architecture was combined with the School of Fine Arts, which included painting and sculpture, this kind of display was important for them. But I think perhaps one of the best rooms to exemplify the ethos of the École des Beaux-Arts is this room here, which was the lecture room. This is the famous lecture room where Viollet-le-Duc came to discuss medieval architecture and was sort of booed by the students. And his replacement, Hippolyte de Taine, came and discussed the more traditional Greek and Roman arts and letters, history of arts and letters, and was cheered by them. And you could see by the very setup of this space how it is that architects at this time in the late 19th century thought about not only what architecture was, what the skills of the architect was to be, but also the idea of the worldview that was inherent in this this notion. So in this room, what's famous particularly is this hemicycle done by Paul Delaroche, showing the transformation of art across the ages from antiquity up to the then present, the French Renaissance. And within this room itself, you have the elements of architecture framing both at the lower level and the upper level. Some of the vistas into the past and present, some physically into the space of the school, others you can see through lecture series or in other instances and photographs, you can see that there are also photographs of paintings that roll away in order to show you this space. And it's in this space that I want to talk about the ways that architecture and fine arts help us to understand where was the West in the past, and in concert with that, where the rest of us were as well. This is just a brief summary slide to give us a sense of the slow and gradual evolution of the École des Beaux-Arts, previously known as the Académie Royale d'Architecture, starting in the 17th century, moving through the 19th century. But it's important for us to remember that this school was always a state-run school system, and that the primary purpose of the school was to establish a code of taste or a canon for the French nation state. So it was always a state apparatus, and it was always a state project. And this is important to remember because at the same time as we're having France move from an absolutist state, sometimes back and forth between a republican state and an absolutist state, we also have France continuing to expand itself as a colonial empire. And so figuring out where colonization and colonialism fits into their imperium is a very important element of this, as well as what role architecture played in that particular state project. But when we also think about what was the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, particularly in the United States, we should be thinking about people like Paul Philip Cray, who was a Frenchman, came to the United States, and like many others, either actual French immigrants to the US, or those who were Americans wealthy enough to travel abroad to France to learn the Ecole des Beaux-Arts and come back. He would help to establish some of the educational pedagogies in our first professional schools. Cray himself was connected to MIT. You also had folks like William Barre and other professionals connected to schools like MIT and Harvard, bringing the French ideals to the United States. And this took several forms, but some of the forms that we continue to recognize today include the continued function of the atelier, what we now call the studio environment. And so in France, you had ateliers run by masters or patrons, who most of the time won the Grand Prix de Rome. And because of this noteworthy distinction, because they had won an architectural design prize, they were thought to be a particular kind of expert or specialist. And so we continue to attract these types of people, signature design talent to teach our architectural studios. But we also tell students that the pinnacle of design achievement is to present oneself as a kind of individual genius architect who creates designs and thinks on their own, usually in the splendid isolation of a studio, and to present those ideas as your own. And what's interesting is that in the French system, in the atelier system, you had a similar function, but there was an entire army of folks who would help an individual to create their drawings, a set of drawings, a set of models that they would use to compete for the Grand Prix de Rome, and that the system of using the entire atelier to do this work, it was never quite acknowledged in the authorship of the final product, but was continuously passed on from one generation to the next in terms of how people were trained to produce the work. So there's a tacit acknowledgement that this was a group effort, but a public acknowledgement that only one person would be able to be deemed the genius, the patron, the architect itself. And this hierarchy of authorship is something that I think we still have to contend with today. As much as we love the camaraderie of the studio environment, and as much as we believe in it as an educational space, I think that the way that it tends to promote singular authorship invisibilizes a large group of people. And as we're learning through contemporary histories on people like Julian Francis Abel and others, there are a host of project architects, draftsmen, who were people of color, who, because of the legal forms of segregation against people of color within the profession, or the social forms of segregation against them, could never quite be identified as a genius architect. And the form of reproducing the level of privilege at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts in the American system is something that I think we should revisit. Here's just two slides of some terms that we may continue to hear used that come from the Ecole des Beaux-Arts that should tell us that we're still under its influence today, from the idea of a partie or a charrette, or even the idea of atelier or studio itself, to the notion of a canon or precedent, and particularly this idea that history advances in progressive stages, and that it is really the job of the contemporary architect to somehow materially manifest the form of a contemporary avant-garde. And usually this is through the language of technology or through the language of form, architectural form, in the old-fashioned sense in terms of beauty, but in the contemporary sense in terms of novelty. And this idea of what the Ecole des Beaux-Arts was that we continue to see in our present is not accidental. We can actually trace it through the scholarship on the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. Most historiographies of this movement, of the school and this institution rather, trace it back to not its beginnings, but instead its endings, what they think of as termination after the May 1968 revolution that was happening in Paris, particularly through the form of student protests and student riots in the city, that were taking some of the social critiques happening around the world, from anti-capitalism to anti-imperialism, and transforming it into something that would allow for greater access to privilege by the working classes and the middle classes in the city. And so you had students who were going to school, paying a lot of money, but realizing that the system still had a kind of aristocratic bent to it. And they wanted to equalize the system. And there's a really wonderful history of what this did to architecture within Paris, France, both leveling the access to the upper ranks that would of privilege that were benefits to those who continue to win the Grand Prix de Rome, but also creating kind of proletariat or working class content for some of the architectural projects that were happening within this space, which was something that would never happen in the traditional school. If we look at the explosion of books at certain time periods, we get a sense of who was interested in this movement and why, from Arthur Drexler's famous exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in 1975, which was finally cataloged in 1977, Donald Drew Egbert's book, The Beaux-Arts Tradition of French Architecture, which he had been writing for nearly 15 or 20 years before it was finally published in 1980. And then Robin Middleton, and then subsequently books by David Van Zenten and others on the Beaux-Arts as a 19th century French architectural tradition. And this idea of modern architecture, and particularly even postmodern architecture, continuing from debates within the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, particularly between what are known as the ancients and the moderns, or the very conservative group that looked to literally imitate the architectures of antiquity in order to create beauty in the present, versus those who wanted to use Enlightenment modes of scientific investigation and rationalism in order to understand what this meant, being passed on to 1920s and 30s moderns in the form of functionalism and scientific rationalism and the types of explicitly socialist and environmentalist concerns of the post-war period. This is canonized in different types of literatures, from K. Michael Hayes's book on architecture theory and Kate Nesbitt's book on architecture theory to Harry Francis Mulgrave and David Goodman's ideas. All of these literatures, including what we see as radical pedagogy, is a new, recently new website done at Princeton University under the supervision of Beatrice Colomina. All of these notions look at 1968 as a point of genesis, of a final nail in the coffin of conservatism at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, which led to a kind of liberal and progressive impulse within contemporary architecture theories of the post-war period. This notion of the past, I argue, is one that is extremely Eurocentric in its viewpoint, because it's looking at not only the discourses that were emerging from within the French Ecole and opening out onto Europe itself, but really only understands the implications of these events on citizens in the global north and the ways that architecture is understood, conceptualized, and practiced in these spaces. But at the same time, this 1968 generation that led to the revolution in France is happening. There's also grumblings within colonial territories as they are fighting to become independent and to become post-colonial territories. We can start all the way back in 1952 with Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks, almost immediately anticipating things like the Algerian War for Independence, which would continue from 1954 to 1962. We can look at the ways that in the United States, the civil rights movement had progressed to more radical reactions to American racism, American settler colonialism, and imperialism abroad in the form of Black nationalism. And with the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, we get Amiri Baraka beginning the Black Arts movement, particularly through the Black Arts Repertory Theater School opening in Harlem in 1965 to 66. We get the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. himself, sort of closing this particular generation for certain individuals on April 4th, 1968. And then in 1969, the same year that we are talking about, 68, 69, the same year that we're talking about the student protests in Paris, France, we get a Pan-African celebration in Algiers, now a post-colonial space, looking at the ways that the government, without and being underneath the control of European governments, can establish for itself a new kind of identity, not only in terms of the people and its national myths, but also in terms of the physical patrimony of the state, its architecture, its social customs, the way that it presents itself to the world. So at the same time that we have a liberalizing of certain labor issues and certain socialist and communist understandings of the French state within the May 1968 protests, we also have internationally a kind of post-colonial fervor happening around the world. And in most architectural discourses and disciplinary histories, we don't have a real understanding of what this means. There are, however, a few exceptions. In the last decade or so, there have been publications that look back at what the Ecole des Beaux-Arts have produced, particularly through the United States and what has been termed now as American Empire and what it has produced abroad. So David Brody, who is currently at Parsons, and Rebecca Tinio McKenna, who is a part of, I can't remember the institution now. There are two publications, Visualizing American Empire and American Imperial Pastoral, look at the ways that American governance, particularly in the form of American city planning and American architecture, show itself as a form of colonial control in its different territories and protectorates. And here they're looking specifically at the Philippines, although we can also look at Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and other territories where architectures like that used by Paul Philip Cray to create a garland for the center of Philadelphia in the form of Benjamin Franklin Parkway, stretching from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which we see in the left slide at the very bottom, all the way to City Hall, which we see at the top right slide, or in the form of The White City by Daniel Burnham himself. Both of these projects using the compositional principles of the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, most of the time when we see them in architectural history, discussed primarily through the ways that they cleaned up American cities and established a kind of aesthetic standard for things like Washington, D.C. and other official elements of the state. But what's interesting is that this approach to urban design and architecture was transplanted from the metropole to the satellite or the colony, in this case, the Philippines. If you go to the Philippines, you'll see a bust like this one to Daniel Burnham, who visited the Philippines and thought it was an excellent site to establish a monumental case study in architectural beauty, one that was established by the pioneering minds of European Americans from the United States visiting the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. At this time, you also had an American contingent at the Ecole in France, establishing a set of awards for themselves, since they were not able to run for the Grand Prix de Rome, which was separated for only French citizens themselves. They wanted to establish and repeat the system abroad. And you find it in not only the form of the architecture, but as I'll argue here in this presentation, the ways that this architecture formalized a kind of ethnographical hierarchy that was being established in scientific studies of the mid to late 19th century. And so here we have a provincial capital of Occidental Negroes as a way of locating the racial particularity of those supposedly living in the Philippines. This idea of a hierarchy would be used to establish European Americans at the very pinnacle and Negroes or African Americans at the bottom, and understanding within American empire which elements geographically and racially are able to participate in the beautification of the American city through the notion of the city beautiful, or the model of the white city itself. And so I want to look at the connections here and tease out a little bit some of the ways that state power, architectural codes of beauty and aesthetics, and the actual professional status of the architect come together to create a kind of racial network of power that identifies the architect as a white male, usually, and someone who is able to use both his gender privilege and his racial privilege to codify and order the built environment in a way that is beneficial for state building, and particularly states that are interested in becoming imperiums or colonial territories. This goes all the way back to the state origins of the French Ecole, where what was established was not only a kind of independent space for the academicians to think through general notions of theory, but always through the lens of an aristocratic approach to art. And Donald True Egbert sort of outlines this in his text very well, showing us that all throughout the Ecole, even when you have moderns, the so-called moderns, who are more progressive and much more Republican, much more radical in their tendencies, and that there's a sense that the hierarchy of the aristocracy in terms of privilege and function is something that would order architecture, and by virtue of this ordering, give prestige to the architect himself. We can see this visually in the ways that the state is represented, and the ways then that architects and architecture culture starts to emulate this kind of representation. Here we have from the 18th century representations of Louis XIV and Louis XV, respectively, in the royal blue, with the standard, with the diadem, surrounding themselves with the elements of empire, and the ways that as leaders of France, aristocratic France, they deemed or charged the academicians with establishing a canon of correct taste for the architecture of the French state. So even when French academicians were thinking abstractly about what architecture should be, it was always in service of developing a canon, not just of history, but of French history, and the ways that the French would come to exemplify the perfection of Western civilization in the present. We see this not only in terms of the general program, but also in terms of the specifics of architecture. Which programs of architecture were thought to be monumental and therefore worthy of consideration versus mere building or vernacular. Egbert puts it this way. He says, aristocratic heritage was reflected in the importance assigned to nobility of subject matter. This emphasis on nobility of subject became particularly exaggerated in France, not only because the Academy was founded during the hierarchical age of Louis XIV, but also because it originated as an advisory body to the king as the head of the state. So the members were concerned primarily with the royal and public buildings. And so the collection of drawings that were submitted to the Grand Prix competition is probably the best archive of this. And this is what we inherited in the late 19th and early 20th century as we were establishing professional schools of architecture in the United States. And as I argued before, and others have as well, as you can see, this notion of nobility or aristocracy rubbed off on the architect. What's really interesting is that in monographs by Dana Cuff, Robert Gutman, and others, including Richard Chaffee, Van Zanten, there's an interesting parallel between the hierarchies that were assumed to be associated with the professional architects who went to state schools like the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, who would learn primarily drawing and geometry and the intellectual elements of things separated from the building site, versus the status of the craftsmen themselves. I'm thinking particularly of the Black craftsmen, somebody who in the United States was segregated to industrial academies, not allowed to join the professional schools at Ivy League institutions like Penn and Harvard and MIT. And the vernacular types of architectures that were designated for their control versus the ones that were given over to the architect itself. And Egbert talks about the separation between low social class and high social class elements in terms of the program of the building. And so we start to see then, as a way of edging out competition in the construction industry, a kind of vertical hierarchy of talent, where the architect is the intellectual and the geometer. But in real terms, he is also a white male, usually from a Christian nation, usually a heterosexual oriented individual, and somebody who is working for the authority of the state or the authority of the local elite. And this is something that has shaped professional culture in architecture to give it the social prestige that it continues to have in this present day. We see this historically in terms of the ways that architects now begin to emulate some of their dressing and grooming and social customs on the powerful of that time period. As I mentioned, in social distinction to the so-called practical and low ends means of the Black craftsmen at the time period. And so for me, there's a kind of racial charge to the story of professionalization in the US that parallels the racial charge both within the state in terms of who can be deemed the architect, and the ways that state-controlled architectures then are used to control the entire apparatus of the empire, from the metropole to the satellite, giving clear place both professionally and geographically to white and non-white bodies within this space. So if we take this even a little bit further, let's think about the cultural pedigree of the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. Where was the West at the Ecole, both in France and in the United States? Was there any place for people of color? Was there any place for those who were deemed outside of the global north or in the spaces of Europe then competing for nationalization? This question, in order to answer it, we go back to the hemicycle. And we have to look at the geographical content that is latent within his illustration of the history of arts and letters. In the very center, we have sort of allegories that are imagining the presence of the ancients themselves in this space. And then as we move from the ancients, and most of these ancients, of course, are located within Western Europe, whether it's Renaissance Italy, whether it's certain parts of Germany or France, or nods to England. And then finally, formalized in literal persons as we move from the center outward to look at the historical figures that are there. And these historical figures included people who were painters and sculptors and architects and engineers. And so if you want to know what people thought of as being the West, we can look at this image to get a kind of anthropomorphic representation of that. And by extension, we got a sense of where the world existed for those who went to the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. Anything outside of the geographical territories mentioned by these particular figures was something that belonged to the satellites, the colonies, the territories that were dependent upon the advancement of culture at the center of this space. And so when we look at this hemicycle, I want you to think about not only in terms of the visual figures themselves, but in the architectural traditions, purposefully starting at the Greco-Roman world and moving forward, which purposefully obscures the role of Egypt, even northern Egypt, which people at the time assumed was still white and therefore of Aryan descent and still connected to the cultural pedigrees of Greece and Rome itself. But what I think is interesting is that the periods of interest for Greece and Rome that continue to show up in the rhetoric of the theorists writing at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, it includes more than just what we might refer to as the sort of democratic or republican origins of Greece and Rome. But there's a lot of celebration of the imperial periods of Greek and Roman architecture, particularly as these represent a universal style of building as the empire grows and stretches across the world. And it's very hard not to understand within that context the aspirations of the French government to not only codify architecture at home, but to establish a visual language that could serve as a quote unquote universal style of building that could be spread across the world, not only from the centers of knowledge in Europe, but into the satellite territories. And to me, this sort of subtends a kind of racial charge to most arguments of a universal style of building or a universal style of architecture, universal to whom and under which mechanisms of control, I think, are always important things to remember. So the architectural analog to the anthropomorphic display in De La Roche's work can be found in the architectural references and the sculptures and the samples that were used to train architects and sculptors to understand the patrimony of the classical world. And so this pedigree is something that, for me, is not something that is abstract or taken from history just because those are the best examples from history, but it is part and parcel of the politics of the state and the practical means by which the state is able to homogenize itself across the world. We can see this also in the ways that Orientalism and precedent go hand in hand at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. In addition to the Grand Prix competitions, you would have regular exercises, sometimes sketching exercises, watercolor exercises, sometimes preliminary structural exercises that would prepare students for the rigors of the Grand Prix. And here's one of them that was conducted during the year in the 19th century, which was for, here it's the African city of Ethiopia, the space of Ethiopia, but as a colonial territory. And the project was to bring water infrastructure into the state, but to do so in a way that orientalizes the Western networks of infrastructure that were being brought into the state. And so this happens through several different technologies and several different mediums, both in the form of water infrastructures, in the form of train infrastructures and road infrastructures, different ways that urban planning as a compositional exercise could then be brought into a space, but then stylistically orientalized to so-called match the local context in a vernacular sense. And this was a way of training the local architect who was then studying at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts to understand the difference between the quote unquote Western structure or the Western essence of what was happening within the colonies themselves and the ways that style could be used to soften or even introduce these elements into each territory. We see this on the reverse end in Paris, the center of the nation state, in the form of Albert Leprade's Museum to the Colonies itself, which takes elements of classicism and modernism and combines it with the visual representation of the colonies itself to show the full extent of the French Empire. And in this particular case, as Patricia Morton and others have shown in their studies of this, there's a kind of an attempt to substantiate the economic costs to colonialism itself. Again, using architecture as a way to show the commingling of the different elements of the state, literally using the compositional strategies in plan that would have existed at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, some of the structural engineering that was used within modern architectural projects, and ethnographical depictions of the state itself. And what's interesting about this architect, Laprade, is that he has projects before this building that shows that he can master them in all those different languages, in the Ecole des Beaux-Arts language, in the burgeoning modern architectural language, and then ethnographic studies of new territories in colonial France and some of the suburbs of France where the so-called primitive low-income whites lived, using the methods of ethnography to do so. And so within this space, I like showing this project because it shows that these things were always thought to be coterminous and that their separation was for geographical elements within the empire. Only when showing the empire in its totality do we start to see them commingling and emerging from the same pedagogical sources. Joanna Murwood is somebody who has done a really good job of showing the ways that the ethnographical research in the United States, particularly by those who were trained at the Ecole, people like Richardson beforehand, and then Lewis Sullivan afterwards, were used to, the idea of precedent, the idea of typology was used to establish what was supposedly a new form of vernacularism or autochthonous style of American building, mostly which we know through the Chicago skyscraper, but was also being experimented in other forms by people like Sullivan at the same Chicago World's Fair, this time in an orientalized architecture to represent the so-called Middle West of the United States and to show the inherent potential of that sort of non-European exotic style representing something local and indigenous to the United States. And I'll just end here with this kind of brief speculation on how the Ecole was racialized by thinking about the colonizing mindset that is inherent in the way that drawing and typology and precedent was used at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. For me, I think this is a perfect technology for encouraging cultural appropriation, meaning that the elements of architecture in world cultures that lend themselves to geometrical mastery and representation, as opposed to the elements that tend to be much more difficult to codify, things like spatial practices, things like language customs, things like culinary customs, things that happened within a building, but weren't always perfectly represented by the building itself. They get washed away, they get eliminated, they get abstracted out, which allows for the architect to take the elements of world culture that are most susceptible to fitting within a Western or Westernized mindset and allows for them to focus on the sensuousness of the object. And so by calling this kind of practice abstraction and giving it the kind of neutral categories that one wanted to afford Enlightenment scientific practices, from my perspective, whitewashes the kinds of cultural erasures that were typical and everyday at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. So when we send students out into the world to sketch the world as if they're capturing things in its totality, I actually would argue that the technology of drawing compels the viewer to minimize what they are seeing and to only reproduce the elements that allow for dramatic geometrical control of the built environment in the same ways that were mandated by the French state in the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, and that was used by the American Imperium to colonize and to control territories like Hawaii, the Philippines, and others. And if we don't actually understand the racial charge of this visual technology and the pedagogies of these spaces, then we can actually continue to just repeat the ways that we're training our students and ourselves to continue thinking in a kind of colonized mindset. Instead, I would encourage people to try and decolonize their minds by understanding these roots, but also by understanding and complicating architecture for the layered forms of authorship that it includes, as well as developing definitions of the profession that would have included the folks who I say were edited out, the African-American craftsmen who did not have a chance to really contribute to this discourse and were sidelined as vernacular producers. But if we challenge that mode, then we actually would open ourselves up to a decolonized architectural practice. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I just wanted to leave it there and hopefully open it up for some questions, debates. This is a way of revising the history of the Ecole that I think for me is still speculative and in motion. And so discussion for me would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Charles. Can you guys hear me? Thank you, Charles. A wonderful talk, as always. I also, before we jump into the conversation, I want to welcome those that are remote to log in your questions through the Q&A, and I'll be fielding those questions as we move from the conversation into Q&A. So thank you. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Ellis.
Dr. Davis, thank you very much. That was great.
Did you turn it on?
How's that?
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Very thought-provoking. And we'll be opening it up to questions. But I had one that I'd like to start with. And you sort of, or not sort of, I think you've offered up a new paradigm for the way that we can look at Western architectural education through the Beaux-Arts. Have you yet considered what implications that paradigm might have on, for example, the Werkbund or the Bauhaus, since they weren't really as sponsored as by the state as was the Ecole? Do you think there is still yet a parallel there, and especially according to the way they were drawing?
This is a really good question. I mean, for me, there's slightly different phenomena. I think of, for example, the idea of the Deutsche Werkbund, but then also the Bauhaus, the American Bauhaus, and the ways that, excuse me, in spirit, and Benikoff and Robert Gutman talk about this a little bit. In spirit, they offer a kind of reversal of this rejection of craft and this hierarchy by trying to find a way to integrate craft into the thinking of the architect. And so we can think of the American Bauhaus ideal of starting in the shop, and whether you were a graphic designer or industrial designer or an architect, you learned what material was, you learned how to work through the material, etc. But to me, there's still a kind of rationalization of the craft traditions in ways that aligns it with this idea of the architect as a geometer and the intellect that I think I would still want to challenge there. So even though they weren't officers of the state or educational institutions of the state, I think that there's a project there of aligning the notion of craft with technology that I think is just as homogenizing as the actual statist orientation of neoclassicism and Beaux-Arts classicism in the American and the French case. But I think then the test for that would be a little bit different, to think about who was deemed, even within that integration of craft, as still a craftsman, and whether the idea of apprenticeship had the same kind of guild-like qualities that it had in the past, and whether there were racial and gender forms of exclusion within those forms of practice, I think. For me, those would be the questions that I would start to think about in order to understand both the continuities and discontinuities that were there, that were present in that tradition.
Another idea that you brought up toward the end of the lecture was about the actual teaching of the way that at the Ecole, the actual teaching of drawing, and how that limited the way that the architect could see the world. And of course, your images were, of course, I think a couple of watercolors, one a drawing and another a watercolor, probably taken from the early 19th century, but they were clearly hand-drawn or hand-colored and classical.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the same applies to digital drawing as well?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, as a historian, I'm going to say I don't really know. I'm definitely trying to look at the way that drawing, in the way that Mario Carpo talks about it in his notion of the alphabet and the algorithm, drawing in the hands of Ecole trained architects represents a kind of contract, visual contract for what the ideal of the building should be, and how somehow that rules over all other decisions. Sometimes in the ways that Ruskin might talk about of the craftsman in the actual site, making decisions and creating beauty based on opportunities that are there for him or herself. The drawing seems to be a kind of check against that, a kind of guarantee for the power of the architect. And I remember, on first reading Mario's book and other people's book, this I don't know, I guess naive desire to believe that multiple forms of authorship could be acknowledged within the algorithm, that there were ways that file sharing and the adaptation of different forms of code that were just out there or passed on from one person to another would allow for the multiple authorship of architecture. But then, I see when I look at the architecture magazines and look at who's lecturing, there's still a kind of persistence of this idea that there's still someone at the top making the editing decisions. There's still someone at the top who is responsible for the overall harmony of the work. And in that sense, I think that even calls by shop architects and others to take on more of the responsibilities of the contractor and to return some of the guild-like qualities of making to architecture. As long as it's under the label of shop architects, I'm a little suspicious of it. Like the single authored notion of the architect who controls the work, I think for me is something that is highly specious, not just because it's untrue, but because I think it reinforces a kind of master narrative that props up some of the architectures of the past that were heavily indebted to elitist practices, racial practices, gendered practices, that we no longer have to. We can sort of deconstruct them and think of them in different ways that would allow for us to actually liberate what the algorithm can do in our present moment. So I think there's a kind of cultural memory and institutional memory that prevents the more radical suggestions that I've heard people talk about could occur with digital architecture. To me, it still feels very conventionally architecture. And when I listen to these guys talk about the work, no longer are they talking about the code and some of the other elements that they were talking about previously. It's still just about the form and what it produces and the way that it's produced in terms of manufacturing and technological processes.
Thank you.
Do you want to do one more and then?
So we've got a couple in chat.
Do you want to go there?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions coming in through the chat. Charles, I'll just repeat them for everyone's sake. From Dr. Julie Zook. Thanks, Julie, for your question. She says, thanks for this excellent presentation. Different civilizations and cultures, by their colonizer and colonized, have often characterized spatial patterns. When designers understand, when these designers, sorry, I got distracted. When designers understand these spatial patterns and make them focus the precedent, does it tend towards hegemony in the same way as precedent based on visual form? In other words, are there special weaknesses of the optical or special resources of the spatial?
So I'm not sure if you can still hear me. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I think actually this is a really great question, because there's something that I'm trying to critique in the drawing that is primarily our focus on visual content and architectural formalism, and that the focus on monumental form, both in the form of composing the perfect planimetric diagram and understanding the relationship then between that planimetric diagram and the elevational expression of that, which for people like H.H. Richardson was picturesque, for Daniel Burnham and McKemmead and White, it was much more restrained and classical. That focuses on certain elements of the architectural form that I think erases the spatial complexity. And I think that focusing on spatial complexity brings in a different model of architecture. In the classical world, we might look at someone like Karl Boeticker, who in his debates with Semper, he was really interested in the ways that the precedents of space making, where the table was, who sat where, who entered the room from one space to another, gave dictates to where structure should be placed. And then also then gave a cue as to when an architectural space is ornamented properly or improperly in relationship to that spatial practice. But I'm even thinking about, calling something like the hush arbors of plantations in the American South architectures, because they are spatially choreographed by people who go out into the landscape, they produce a clearing, they orchestrate a kind of ritual within that place. And that same ritual can happen within a building designed specifically for it, or it can happen in a clearing that is made impromptu for that very practice. But to me, if that's what architecture is, if architecture is a kind of spatial practice, and I don't know, I tend to talk about it as a material form of social praxis, with the materiality happening on several scales, what we currently call vernacular or monumental. But that if the cue is the space, then the architecture is the response to it. And the complexity then becomes in the space-making practice itself. And at least in my study of African-American material culture and expressive culture, this is a really wonderful way of connecting what the licensed architect did to what the Black craftsman did, to what the everyday homemaker but entrepreneur, like the home builder and those who were building their small businesses did. They choreographed spaces in ways specific for that cultural group. And then they marshaled the expertise of other professionals, whoever they're deemed to be, to help to substantiate that work. I think that definition of architecture that is more spatially predicated brings in much more of the cultural practice. It's not erased or whitewashed. And I think it challenges us to rethink who is the author of that space. Who's the one who really gives it life? Who's the one who's really the geometer of that interior space? It's not someone who professionalized to purposefully write out and to edge out the works of the Black craftsman, but somebody who worked in tandem with that person in practice. I would much more ethically feel like I could call that person an architect without repeating some of the racial prerogatives of the past than not so.
Thank you, Charles. We have a few more questions from the virtual room here from Dora Epstein-Jones. She says, thank you, Charles. Wow. I wonder if you have connected with the charge of the French Academy to establish Académie Française to establish a French language with that of the encyclopedists to establish a language of architecture as part of the larger project of French nationalism and harmonization that you demonstrate so well today. It's earlier than the Ecole, but I'm thinking about the entire workings of a state apparatus embedded in language.
I think that's a really excellent recommendation, both like in the Foucauldian sense, understanding the earlier calls within architecture theory, some within France, some within England and Germany, to think about architecture as a language, as a form of rhetoric, visual rhetoric, and understand what that meant in line with this idea of ethnographically, that certain languages were expressive of certain kind of cultural specificities. And some of those specificities fit within a family of languages that were Western in the kind of sense of 19th century racial anthropology, but others fell outside of it. They were sister languages or mother tongues that seem to be originating elsewhere. And I think that there might be a way to make such a claim there that I think is really quite interesting. I think it's an excellent recommendation to kind of explore the pedigree of ideas there. But I'm only just starting on this project, so this is a really great recommendation, I think, to extend that beyond the 19th century French Ecole.
Fantastic. Charles, do you have time for a couple more questions that have come in?
I do, yes.
Okay, thank you. From Brandon Shea, thank you for the insightful talk, weaving together nation and colony alongside center and periphery in terms of the values and biases which tint the history of architectural education. I'm wondering how your historical research might inform a critical discursive position on the evolution and impact of architectural education in the Middle West via the empire system of the land grant universities, of which our fine institution here, Texas Tech, is an example of. Thank you.
This is a really great question. In that sense, I think I would be following some other really great historians. There are folks like Maura Lucking, who's a PhD student at UCLA. She's looking at the ways that land grant institutions, particularly those that were established for industrial educational academies, we're following some of the colonial logic that was implicit in the work of people like Frederick Law Olmsted and others who were thinking of landscape as a way of colonizing place and space. There's also folks like Summer Sutton, who's just finishing her PhD at Yale University. She's looking at the ways that Native American groups had been forced to work at some of these industrial academies, sometimes with African Americans, sometimes on their own, forced to work under the label of vernacular talent as opposed to architectural talent. And the hierarchy within the university structure, with the land grant university serving a local population and sometimes a local subject population in terms of their racial or ethnic identity. That there was a kind of hierarchy there that was ready-made because of the aristocratic leanings of the Ecole system itself. And so there are people doing really excellent work, not only confirming this, but I think what's more interesting is that they're showing that the notion of design and of authorship in these spaces by these people of color, these groups of color, that they exceeded these labels, that they often crossed territories, crossed strategies and tactics. And so there was a semantic game of trying to recategorize and to minimize what it was that they were doing because they were demonstrating every day the capacity of subject peoples who were not supposed to be the intellect, the geometer itself. And so I think telling that story of professionalization, a kind of countercultural story of professionalization, as it relates to the land-grant university, as it relates to the hierarchy of architectural talent versus the vernacular that we've inherited, I think could be a tremendously interesting story, especially then as we think about the later evolution of land-grant universities into state institutions in their own right that then try to emulate the elite practices of the profession, and then looking at that long history, I think would be quite fascinating. So I think it's a wonderful question, and I think that there are folks working on it that, at least from my perspective, I'm following and trying to make connections to other broader critiques.
It's clear, Charles, your presentation has stimulated some wonderful discussion and questions. We have one last one, if you can hang on for one more. From Caleb Lightfoot. He asks, thank you for this incredible lecture. Do you think that the revolutionary zeal of the 1968 riots, despite the committed agitation of certain organizers, was ultimately incorporated into the French Academy as ineffective petty bourgeoisie radicalism? If so, do you see the same thing at work in American architectural education today? I'm going to stop there. That's already quite a lot. We can answer the second part in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both and. It's yes and no. So I do agree that like most radical experiments and tendencies tend to be assimilated into the hegemonic state. It's literally the job of the hegemonic state to find ways to assimilate the most radical parts of its culture to maintain itself. So, for example, we're having this conversation in an institution of higher learning, and the academy is a place where we can have these ideas safely without people thinking that we're going to take over the government or establish a new kind of political system. We can experiment here and document ad nauseum without actually encouraging the overturning of the government itself. But it is important to have these things recorded, because there are cultural moments when the general populace tires of the hegemony, and the set of ideas that are available for people who are decision makers to make changes is very important to have. So you need to be able to articulate very complex ideas very quickly for those who are in the decision making space in order to give them a sense of how things should change. And so for me, like, answering this question becomes difficult because, you know, like I often get into debates with people about, well, should you try and reform architectural academies? Should you just start over? Should you start new institutions? Is the real focus of or locus of power outside? Like, where's the real fulcrum for change? And my answer to all of this is yes. Like, we need all of those spaces, right? Like it really, like, my desire, if I were emperor for a day, what I would want is for every architectural school, every architectural academy to have a space where a radical thinking outside of its normal, outside of its hegemon, is supported financially. Like, you have a space where some crazy radical does experiments that are anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, that are socialist, that are communist, instead of like leaving it to the students to do this work and to introduce surreptitiously, or forcing professors to change their language, that we actually take advantage of the fact that we are factories of thought, of knowledge production, and that we can actually be liberating people by giving them the ability to think freely on those things. So not just training people to be good architects and to fit within the kind of capitalist system that we have, or globalist system that we have, in the neoliberal mindset of you have to go out and have your own practice and you have to get licensed and all these forms of gatekeeping. But like, to say, guess what? We're in an architectural educational academy. We can do whatever. Here's one of the things that we are doing to contribute to thought that we have no idea how it will help the world, but it's allowing us to think beyond the traditional boundaries of the practice. And I think that the professionalization of our academy is one of the things that I worry about, particularly for the last few generations. We're gonna have really good technologists and technicians. I don't think we're gonna have really good intellectuals unless we give them the space to do that work.
Last thoughts? Well, Charles, thank you again. And I want to invite everybody to a virtual applause, and those here, thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Take care and we'll talk soon.